And with that, we are going to start our lecture on CSS. So CSS is the skin of the web page. So if you kind of remember what we were saying yesterday with HTML, we made this comparison, like this metaphor that HTML is like the skeleton of the web page, right? Because it's the building blocks that we use to give it the form that it has. In exchange, CSS would be like the skin of the web page. So it's what makes the web page beautiful, what it makes it shine, what it gives the layout that it has. And basically, it is what lets us have a better experience when interacting with websites. So in this lecture of CSS, we are going to be seeing the basics of CSS. So we're not going to cover everything today. We're going to divide this into lectures because doing CSS in one day would be too much. So we're going to be doing today the basics, and tomorrow we're going to be the second lecture of CSS, which will be CSS responsive. So today is going to be a small introductions of CSS. We're going to also talk about the selectors in CSS. We are going to talk about the specificity, and we are going to talk about the box model. So these are all the topics that we are going to be dealing with today in CSS, and the skills you're supposed to acquire after today, after the lecture and also after the practice, is to be able to outline the principles of CSS, identify how to target elements, control a style via specificity, and relate the box model principles for styling. So we're going to be watching all of these in the next slides. So let's first jump into the introduction of CSS, because CSS is the way we add styling to our web page. But let's see a bit more before we actually jump into the coding part, see how we can actually alter the code. Let's see a little bit of the history. So, Valentin, can you please read this?
CSS makes your website shine, pleasant to the eye, and ease the navigation with nice layouts and formats.
Okay, so this is the basic of CSS. So what does this mean to you? So what do you think that CSS is going to be able to style, what it's going to be able to do, and what it is basically used for? So, and this is generic, it's not just for Valentin, it's just in general for you guys. Yes, Kiran, sorry. Changing of language in German is gr, so I just keep changing the R's of everybody. I'm sorry if I butchered your names, correct me.
I think I've been called about 15 different names in the last 2 days. It's completely fine. I've lived here for long enough that my last name changed from Walker to Valker.
It won't take long.
As far as I'm aware, that this is for changing colors, layouts, sizes of certain borders and brackets, colors of like every element, individual elements using like an ID, or like the full class of every single class using, I think, use a dot for that, but that's my understanding of it anyway, making it pretty. Right.
Perfect. Okay, so anybody else wants to, because he said about changing borders, colors. Yes, Dennis?
We can also add animations to it, box model.
Yes, we can. So yes, the box model is not exactly about the animations in itself, but we can add some animations through CSS. So that is something that we can also do. Very well. So the box model is more about the margins and the paddings, but we will get into there later on. So what else, Anna?
Yeah, we can change the position, the behavior of position, and we also can like make it sticky or fix it. So yeah.
Okay, very well. So we can alter the position of the elements. What else, Miguel?
We can also change the font size, the color, the background color, change the layout. So basically everything that has to do with styling an HTML element, we do it with
Mhm.
CSS.
Okay, perfect. Valentin?
I just wanted to add responsiveness of the website
Perfect.
for mobile.
Mhm. So all of what you said is exactly correct. So CSS basically what allows us is basically to give layouts to the web page, to position the elements where we want to give background colors, to give image as backgrounds, to create borders, margins, to create animations in the website, and responsiveness. So CSS is like it's not just about making it pleasant to the eye, um, but it's also about making it easy to use. Make a web page not only something beautiful to see, but also something that the user has a very good experience with. Because this is like when we use a website or when we use a web application, the point of it is not just to be pleasant to the eyes, not just to look good. It's also that the user, when is interacting with the web page, has a good experience. How we do achieve this good experience? Through multiple things. Responsiveness is one of them. So when someone opens a website in a mobile phone or in a laptop or in a screen, it can be visible and the layout is nice and looks good. It doesn't matter where you open it. Another way also is taking into account how you lay out the elements. So for example, something that I don't think is like talk a lot, but normally when you have a web page, you have certain elements that you expect to be always in the same place. Like for example, if you have a navigation bar, you expect to be on the top, right? So you're not going to expect a navigation bar to be at the bottom. So those are some elements that you can actually take into account with CSS, that you can style those elements to be where you want them to be, look beautiful, but also give the user experience like those expectations they have about the website. Another thing that, for example, we do is if you actually use a website or an application in your mobile phone, especially if you have small hands, uh, some of the CSS, what it can do is give you a better experience by situating the layout of the elements in reach of your finger, right? So for example, if you have buttons in a mobile phone screen, it's more likely that you are going to put those buttons at the bottom because it's easier to reach. So this is some of the things that CSS is going to help us do to have those layouts so we can create something beautiful, but also something that is going to give our user a really good experience when it's interacting with our web page. So with that, again, HTML is the skeleton, CSS is the skin, and then together they form the visible part of the web page. So CSS was invented by Håkon Ljung-Lis, which he was working with Tim Berners-Lee. So in 1994, while working together, because Tim Berners-Lee had created HTML, he decided that he wanted to create something that would make the websites more beautiful, like something that could style them. So Tim Berners-Lee didn't saw a necessity for this because his idea of the HTML and the web was not about visual. It was not about all of us using it. For him, it was like a research purpose. So he just wanted to create that for researchers to share the information. So he saw the CSS or like the styling of it something superfluous that didn't has any purpose. However, for Håkon, it was important, and therefore he created a CSS, which CSS stands for Cascadian Style Sheets. So Cascadian Style Sheets is actually a name that is very important. We are going to see later on why, but it represents very well how the CSS actually works in actually the layout. When you write CSS, it's important to take into account what you write first and what you write last, because whatever you write last is going to prevail. We will get into that a little bit later, but that is the importance of why it's called Cascadian Style Sheet. So it became the standards for the web in the 1999, and it is based on another language called Argo. So the Argo Style Sheet is another language that is also a styling language. in the same way that HTML was based on another markup language. And this Argo language, we don't use it. It's not as easy to use. That's why it was not successful. But Hakom made CSS, although if it was based on the Argo style sheets language, he made it way more easier to use and more scalable. So that meant that it easily it soon became like the standard for the website, and it is nowadays still basically what we use. So it's not only that we use CSS for the websites, but any language or any framework that we use to style. For example, you're probably going to be doing Bootstrap during the bootcamp or Tailwind. Those two are frameworks that use the basis of CSS to style websites. So in a way, CSS is everything that we're going to be using to style websites or web app applications. So CSS, what it is. So this CSS is a style sheet language, right? So it adds styles. But the fundamental of it is a rule-based language, not a programming language. In the same way that we said HTML is not a programming language because it's just a markup language, this is not like, this also has no logic in it. It's just rules. So with CSS, what you are going to be doing all the time is just establishing rules of the style that you want to give the HTML elements. Also, the documents contain a collection of rules whose purpose is to target and alter the presentation of the HTML elements. What we understand for HTML elements are the different tags. So for example, a paragraph, which is the P tag, that the P tag could be an element. The anchor tag would be another element. So normally for elements, we understand all the tags that we find in HTML. So tag and element are kind of interchangeable words for the same thing. So this is an example of, for example, YouTube, like a website without or with CSS. So this is the difference that you can see that CSS can do in a website. So imagine this here. It does look not exactly bad. It's just a basic HTML, but it doesn't look the best. And also, this would be very difficult for a user to interact on, right? So imagine that you want to find here the correct video. Like it's difficult to go to music, to sports, because the selection is not good. You can get easily to the home and to the trending, but like all the videos that you here see immediately so easy, here they are not there because the HTML, the problem that it has is the elements are going to appear one underneath the other. So they have a preset layout that it renders from top to bottom into our screen, and they're going to appear in column. So CSS is going to help us to make it look beautiful, to give a better experience, like I said before, and make it usable, make it our website usable. So the syntax of CSS, because we said that CSS is basically a rule-based language, what we are going to be having in CSS is rule sets. So rule sets are declarations, blocks that alter the appearance of an element. So this is, for example, a rule set. This rule set is targeting H2 elements. So whenever I write the H2 element here, this means that I am targeting all the H2 elements within a web page. And these here are the curly braces. So you're going to be seeing curly braces a lot. They are basically what create a block of code. So whatever is between curly braces is a block of code. And in this case, these blocks of codes are called rule sets. So in this case, we have the H2, which is the HTML element, the HTML element that we're targeting. Then we have the curly braces, and then we have the first rule. Okay. However, we can have more than one rule in here. Right now, we only have one, but we could have 2, 3, 4. As many as we need to style the element to our liking. So each rule set is composed of several elements: the selector, the properties, and the values. So the selector would be this, the element that we use to target, like what we use to target the HTML elements that we want to style, right? So the selector is the element of the rule set that points which HTML element is going to be targeted. Then we have the declaration that comes right after the selector, which is put between the curly braces because that is what it makes a block of code. And so you open it and you close it, right? So you have to have a start and an end marked by those curly braces. And then you have inside the curly braces the CSS declarations or rules. So the rule set is the conjunction, like the sum up of all the rules that you put inside this block of code. So these rules are made of a property and a value. So the property would be the styling of the HTML element that we want to alter. So for example, color is in reference to the font color. So with this, you're going to be able to change the color of the fonts in your HTML. So that means that now all the titles are going to have a red color. And this is the value. So the value is the actual, it describes the way we want to alter the targeted style of the element. So if we are using the color property when we use red, that means that we are gonna make sure that all the H2 titles have a red color in the font, right? So we could, instead of color, we could also have background color. And then if we would say background color red, that would actually style the background of the element and not the font. So we could have then a red background. So then it's imperative to have proper punctuation in CSS, because if not, it's going to break. So it is very important that you write the colon right after the property. And when you finish giving the value, you end the rule with the semicolon. If you don't do this, the problem is CSS is not going to compile correctly. And that means that it's actually going to cause a lot of problems. And probably after you have these, like if you haven't written this, like none of your CSS is going to be read into the web page. So the web page is just going to present with the basic HTML, and you're not going to see any styling in it. So it's really important for you to write always the colon and the semicolon. Okay, and now we're going to see different types of CSS. So if there's any questions about what we have said until now, please do let me know. So we have three types of CSS. We have the inline type of CSS. This is a bad practice. Not always. There are some instances where we can use inline style, but in most cases, the inline style is not going to be used. The inline styles, as you can see here, is normally used within the same HTML page. So that means that the HTML page, when we want to target an element, we can write here, for example, inside the H1 element, so the attribute style, and in that attribute pass a rule set, which is going to be between quotation marks. So in between the quotations, we establish the property, we do the colons, the value, and then the semicolons. So these styles are applied directly on the HTML elements in the HTML file. The problem of this, and what is a bad practice, is because it's really hard to keep consistency throughout the web page. One of the key elements to CSS is that we can give our web page some visual and thematic consistency. And that can be achieved easily thanks to the CSS. However, when we use inline style, we are going to have to target the elements one per one. So that means that we are going to have to write double the code. It's not going to be reusable. And it's going to cause that sometimes, because we're going to have to target all the individual elements. If we want to make all the H2 elements look the same, we're going to have to go to each H2 element and give it a style with the same color. And you maybe accidentally forget one, and then that H2 is not going to have the proper styling. So keeping this consistency is harder because you have to go looking each element and make sure that you have styled it accordingly to your consistency, like to the theme that you chose. Then not all the styles are applicable to this inline styling, like hovering effects, which is problematic for links, because in links, in a lot of cases, we use the hovering effects so people can actually see that there's a link and if the link is active or not active, right? And also the poor maintainability and scalability of the code, because that means that you're going to have to write way more because you have to target and write the same code over and over for the same elements. So that means that instead of writing a code that we can reuse, that we can use to target all the H2 elements, we'll have to write the same code over and over, and that is going to cause us a lot of problems for readability. So if you have, the more you write within a page, the more difficult is going to be to read the code afterwards. And the more that you mix the concerns, and when I mean the concerns, is like styling and structural concerns. So HTML is the structure, right? So it's a structural concern, while the style is a styling concern. So the CSS is going to take that. When you mix them, it's more difficult to use it and it's less easy to maintain. So to keep the readability, the maintainability, and scalability of our code, we are not normally going to choose the inline style. So the inline style is something that we can use in some cases when we want, upon a situation, override a styling that we have made in our CSS style sheet. In most cases, we're not going to be using it, but if we want to, in some instance, override this styling, then we can use it for that, because the inline style is always going to override any other CSS type of styling. But again, just for small instances where we really want to override something. Then we have the internal style. The internal style is written in the head of the HTML document. So that means that we have, in the same way that we have the meta tags and the title, we have the style tags inside the head. And those style tags are written inside. So inside those style tags, we have the rule sets that we saw before in the exact way that we saw them. Just give me a second. So, for example, this here, we have the style, right? And inside we have the rule set. So we're targeting here the H1, that is our selector. We have the curly braces, so that is the declaration. And inside we have the rules. So in this case, it's just one rule where we are targeting the color property and giving it a value of red. So in this case, internal style is still not considered to be a good practice, because again, the maintainability and the scalability of the code is tricky, because this is only this styling is only going to be applying to the HTML file where you are writing this code, right? So that means that you would have to write the code in here, and then if you want to give the same styling to, for example, you write this in an index.html, and then you have the about us HTML, and you want to have the same styling for titles and the same, like for, sorry, not for titles, for headings and for paragraphs, etc. Then you're going to have to write the same code in the about us HTML. So that means that you're going to have to repeat the code, even though this is a bit more scalable than the inline, because you are still going to be targeting all the elements of the same page. of the same file, of the same HTML file, still you're going to have to write the code again for the next file in the web page. And therefore, it's going to still cause some scalability issues, and you're going to have to apply, like, you're going to have to rewrite the same code, which from the get-go now, just know that when you have to rewrite the same code over and over, you're doing it wrong. Normally, the code that is the same over and over, it's supposed to be written only once, and you have to find a way to apply it for everything that you need. That would be the best practice, to only have to write the same piece of code once. And with that, we are going to the external, which this is the best practice and when we would like to use most of the time. So the external is called external because we write it in an external CSS file. Like in the same way that we have the index.html file, we go and create into our project another file that is going to be called .css. And this external file is imported into the HTML file in the head by using a link. So we have the link, right? So you can see it here. The link has a relationship, so rel for shortcut, and how we write it. And that will be, the relationship is the style sheet, because that is what CSS is. Then you can write the type, which is text CSS. So if you don't write the type, it's not going to break. You can not write it. So that would be no problem. However, if you want to, like, this would be the type that you have to use. And then the href could be the relative path to your CSS file. So in the same way, remember that we were linking yesterday, for example, our other HTML files or images that we have inside through the anchor tags and through the like the src of the image. So in the same way, the href of the link works similarly. So you can pass the relative path of your CSS files in there. This is way more scalable than the other two, and the bigger benefit of the external styles is that it can be imported into multiple HTML files. So that means that the code that you write in one file can be used throughout your whole web page. It doesn't matter that you have index.html, about us HTML, contact us HTML. Doesn't matter how many files you have. You can use the same style sheet for all of them, because you can import the same style sheet in all the files. And that makes our code way more scalable. It makes it work so we only have to target the same element once, and all throughout the web page, we are going to have the same styling for that element. So if we're targeting, for example, an H2 element, that means that it doesn't matter if we are in index CSS or about us, index HTML or about us HTML. All the H2 are going to have the same color, the same font size, the same background. Whatever we establish in that CSS is going to apply to all our web page. That keeps consistency, that keeps scalability, because you only have to write the same rule set once, and that makes it also have these separate concerns, help us have a better readability. So because we are separating the styling from the structuring, which is the HTML from the CSS, it's going to be way easier to read. It's going to be way easier to find out the elements that we need to find out in our web page. And basically, that is why external style is what we're going to be using 99% of the time. Internal style, the one that we saw before, we barely use it. I don't think that I have ever used it apart from in the primer, because it's not something very scalable. And the inline style may be used a bit more, but like I said, it's only in the instances where you want to override something from the external style sheet, because the inline style is always going to prevail over any other styling. And with that, so the only problem that may happen when we have a CSS file, which is not that of a big problem, is that it can increase the loading time of the web page, as it is an additional HTTP request that our browser has to do, our client, right? So that could increase the loading time, but in general, it's not a big problem. And during the bootcamp, you're gonna see different ways of how to solve this. With that, we're now going to go into selectors. So for the selectors, we are going to talk about how we can target the HTML elements. And when we are doing selectors, I'm actually going to open a program and I'm going to start coding. I haven't done it until now because I wanted to get through the basics, like the inline, the external style, a bit more quicker. But now we're going to start seeing in VS Code how we can actually use selectors. So first of all, selectors are patterns used to select the elements you want to style. So that means that our selectors target and apply styles to specific elements. That means, for example, I can target through the selector the H2 elements in a web page. I can target the paragraph elements, but also I can target elements not only through the name of the tag, like we have been seeing until now. We can target elements through other in another ways. So, for example, in this case, is because we have very different types of selectors. So until now, we've only seen one, which is the select element selector, but we have many. So we have several categories. We have the simple selectors. The ones that we have seen, which is the element selectors, belong inside this simple selectors category. We have the combinator selectors, the pseudo class, the pseudo element selectors, and the attribute selectors. In the primer, and what you probably are going to be using most of the time, we are going to focus on the simple selectors and maybe see a little bit of the combinator selectors. The pseudo class, the pseudo elements, and attribute selectors is something that we're not going to be using much. You can explore it on your own. However, we barely use it. It's something that exists and there are people who use it. But in my experience, for web developers, they are not that necessary. You can target elements in another way. So we're going to start with the simple selectors. The simple selectors have different types. The first one is the element selector, which are the HTML tags. Those are the one that we have already seen, right? So the H2, the paragraph, the H1 element. Then we have the classes. Those are called class selectors. So classes is an attribute, like the class is an attribute that you can give to the elements in the HTML. And those are going to be our class selectors. So we're going to use those classes that we give as attributes to target specific elements of the web page. Then we have the IDs. So if you saw yesterday, we were seeing how the inputs have all these IDs. So these IDs make them unique elements, right? So we said that each ID should be unique to one element in the file. And that is because the IDs are going to use to be identifying that unique element. And also, we are going to be using them to style elements that we may be, like they could have another styling, but we want to override that specific styling that all the other elements have. And we do that by targeting the ID of that element. And then we have the universal selector. The universal selector is the selector that basically we use less, but you're gonna see it often at the beginning of the CSS style sheets. This selector is used to target all the element within the web page, and normally in the web page, what we use it for is to reset the default styling of the browser. So all the browsers have this default styling for HTML elements, as we saw yesterday, right? So titles and paragraphs, they do have some margins, they have some padding, etc. Those stylings are going to be reset by using the universal selector, so you can start from scratch with the styling that you want to give your web page. And here is basically where I am going to be opening our project for yesterday. Just give me a second, and we are going to actually see how all of this works. So I'm following while this loads because my VS Code is taking a little bit. Okay, so the element selector is, like we have already seen, that is our, for example, our tags, right? So you can use the H2, the paragraph. So we're going to see how that actually works in our project. So just give me a second. I'm just opening it. So now, okay. So I'm gonna open our index again with our live server, and that is loading. Just give me a second because it doesn't want to open now. It was just taking a little bit. Okay, so this is our HTML from yesterday. So we're gonna work on this to give it some styling now. So we're gonna open the index.html, and in the index.html, I have the table, some images, like these links. So in this case, if I want to create an external file, I can just do this. So, styles.css. And as long as it has the .css, it's going to be a file that is a CSS file, right? So that is going to work for us. So this is styles.css. You can call it really whatever you want. However, by convention, we normally call it styles or style.css. But anyway, you can call it whatever you want. It's not mandatory. It's just a convention. And like I said yesterday, like web developers, we are creatures of convention, and we do things per convention because it makes it easier to actually understand what other developers are doing. So if you come to a program, you know that the styles.css is going to be the main CSS style sheet in the whole project. And if there are other style sheets with other names, those are going to be targeting very specific files, or they're going to be doing something specific that is not generic to the whole web page. So in this case, now we have the styles.css, right? So now we can actually create the link. So by default, it already writes for me the style sheets. So now I'm just gonna do style.css, and with this should be okay for it to work. So let's test it. So let's see now. We're going to start with universal selector. So the universal selector is this. Let me find it because my new keyboard, I'm not really sure what it is. Indeed. Okay. Okay. So this could be our universal selector. So this universal selector selects all the elements. So the most typical thing that you're going to be seeing is that you are going to be resetting the margins, the paddings, and the box sizing, right? So that way you can see that immediately the margins went away, there's no paddings, and the content is set to border box. So border box is basically the sizing, like the content of the elements, it stays within the box that they have, and the box is basically made by the parent HTML elements. Do you remember that I told you that when you have an opening and a closing tag, you create a box, right? Where you have all the elements inside are like the children. So that is what the box sizing border box does. It means that the elements, the children elements, are going to, the content of them is going to stay within the parent element and is going to be visible. And that is the border box sizing. So with this, we just reset the styling. So we are just giving no styling at all. Really, we just like taking away the margins, the paddings, and resetting the box sizing. Now, after this, we have the element selector. So in this case, we have an H1 element in our web page, right? So we want to change the color of that. So let's say that we are going to be, for example, I'm going to establish the font size. So the font size is how big the font is. And in this case, the font size, we can say that we are going to be 20 pixels, right? So 20 pixels is going to be the font size that we give to our H1 element. Here you can actually see, for example, if I give 30 pixels, it's going to become bigger. So we are right now only targeting the H1 elements and changing the font size of it. Normally, browsers do have a default font size, which could be 16 pixels, right? For most, like for paragraphs, for list, etc., the default setting is going to be 16 pixels for the font sizing. The exception would be the titles, because the titles do tend to have a preset font size that is bigger depending on what you use. If you use an H1, it's going to be bigger. If you use an H2, it's going to be a little bit smaller than the H1, but it's still going to be bigger than normal font, like that you would find in a paragraph or in a list. So in this case, what we're doing, we're just altering the font size of the H1 elements. We can also give it a color. So for example, this color is going to alter the font size color. So let's say that we are going to do violet. Now, so you can see that the title color has changed. We have a color in there. And now let's say that we want to target, for example, the H2 elements. And the H2 elements are going to be 20 pixels instead of 30. So they are a little bit smaller. And instead of blue violet, let's just put blue. So we can actually differentiate the main title from the smaller titles, right? And then if we wanted to, we could select the H3 elements and give it, for example, font size 15 and color green, right? So this is, let's put 16 because 16 is the default for the letters, right? So the other letters right now are going to be 16 pixels. So if you want to make this bigger, you can actually just do this and maybe like change like some of the pixels sizing. So we're going to put 40, 30, and 20. Okay, so now this is just what we saw until now. Those are the elements, right? The element selectors. We are using the elements of the HTML file to target them and to style them. Now let's see how I can do a class selector. So the class selector could be, for example, if I go and I say, for example, for this section, let's say that in this section, I'm gonna write a class, and that class is going to be, we can call it just section actually, right? And this section, we are going to be using it to target that specific section. So for classes, when we give a class, we can use the dot to use that specific class as a selector. So we will write the dot and then the class that we have, which in this case is section. Let's say that for the section, we're going to be using a margin, a padding, and a border. So the margin in here is going to be 20 pixels. The padding is also going to be 20 pixels, and the border is 1 pixel solid and black. Yes, Naeem?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that when you write down the section and then the curly bracket, how did these margin, padding, and border automatically came as an example?
That is because I have something called Copilot that accelerates my way of writing code, which is a paid program. So you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to write it manually.
Okay.
But yeah, so for me, it's the program, and it's because it makes it easier when I'm teaching. Because if I have to write all of this by hand, it can take a long time, right?
Okay.
But yeah. So in this case, we have some margins or padding and some border. You don't know still what the margin and the padding is, but we're going to be seeing later on in the box model, so you can have like an idea. Probably margins you already know, because if you have been in school, you know what the margins are for the documents, right? The Word documents. So this is the same. So you're giving some space to the element. So right now we're only using, we're only styling this specific section. So what would happen if now I go to each section that I want to give this class, and so class, and we're going to use section, and I'm going to actually copy paste it so it's easier on me. In section. Okay. Okay, that should be it. So now you can see that all of the sections that I have, right, are in there. So they are getting that styling. So actually, I think I have section. I accidentally put a class in here that I didn't want to write. Okay, so why would we use classes? Right now, I want to target all the sections specifically that are in the outside. So I have, for example, inside this section that has the class section, I have another 2 sections in here. So I don't want those inner sections to have the same styling, to have the same visuals that the rest of the sections. I want to make them just look different, right? So the problem is if I use the selection here, like the section element in here, and I don't write the dot, I am using the element. So that means that all the sections within my web page are now going to have the same styling. But I don't want that. I don't want these 2 sections, which are inside of a bigger section, to have that styling. So by creating a class and giving a class to the sections that I want to specifically style like this, I can target only those and leave these other 2 sections to be styled with another element. Yes, Kiran?
So this might sound pretty obvious, but we can, when you've made a class and you've called it section, that's At first, it confused me a little because you were calling them both section, but I understand that they're both completely separate. You just named it section. Can we name that literally whatever we wanted, the class?
Whatever you want.
As
Whatever you
long as
want.
it's consistent with each one that you want to use.
Exactly. So I name it
Okay.
section just because it was easier, because I'm
Yeah.
not very creative. But yeah, so you can call this, as long as you are using here the same name as you are using in your
Class, yeah.
HTML. Like, for example, imagine, like, let's actually alter so you can see it, these two sections. Like, let's give it a class. So in this case, instead of section, like, we are gonna set subsection, right? So this is the section tag, but we are just writing another word, right? So I'm gonna copy this because I'm the queen of typos. So if you think something not working, probably it's a typo. It happens to me a lot. So just be aware of that. So if something does not work within my program, start looking for typos. And I
Yeah, that's
advise you
fine,
to
yeah.
do. So okay, so for example, now we would have, like, we can make the same styling. So right now it would be the same, but let's say that I don't want to give it a border because I don't want them to have borders, but I want to keep the margin or the padding, or I want, like, the margin and the padding, I want to give it I want to make it a little bit smaller because I don't want as much margin, right? So now this subsection, because we have the same words, it's going to be styling each one of them according to this, as long as it's the same word. So that is for class elements. Then we do have IDs. So in the case of IDs, we have, like, all the elements within the HTML can have an ID. The ID is to locate it, like in the same way that all the elements, like all the HTML elements, can have a class attribute. So for example, let's say that we have this ID table, right? So this ID can help us locate a very specific section within all the sections and give it another styling depending on what we want, right? So right now that would be this here. Let's say that, for example, we want our table, our section table, to be, like, to have a different styling. So in this case, I'm gonna go and I'm going to write the hash, not the 3. So the hash is going to target the table section, right? And let's say that I'm going to write something similar, but I'm going to maybe give a bigger margin. So it's going to be, instead of 20 pixels, let's say that we want 40 pixels. So now you can see that we are styling this. And although we are using the section before, right? So here we are targeting the section because the table is using an ID. An ID is specific to one element in the web page. That means that when you write an ID, it's going to override whatever you write with classes, and whatever you write with classes is going to override the rules that you make for element tags. Someone had a question?
Yeah, I had a question, but you cleared it. Like, I was confused that can we use the ID with the class? So yeah, now I'm clear.
Yes, you can. So the ID and the class are just ways for us to override the styling. So for example, imagine that I have sections. So I can give a styling to the sections if I want. Like to the, so if I have, for example, this element here and I have the section, and that has to do with this specificity of the elements. Let's say that I want to give this, for example, 10, right? I want to give it 10, not 20. I want to give it 10 and no border, right? So let's say that I'm going to command this subsection out. Okay, so now this section in here, what it's doing is it's giving a styling to all the elements in the web page that are a section, right? However, right after we have our section class, so the class section has a higher specificity. So the higher the specificity something has, the most likely, like that is the thing that is going to actually render, the styling that is going to apply. So you can see a specificity by toggling over the tag. So for example, if I toggle over the section selector, I can see that the selector specificity is 001. So the first 0 goes for IDs, the second 0 goes for classes, and the 1, which can also be a 0, that number stands for elements. If you actually go here to the universal selector, we see that the specificity is going to be 000. That means that this is going to be override by everything we write afterwards, because the specificity of this element is really, really low. If we go to H1 element, the specificity is 001. So that means that this can override the universal selector because it has a higher specificity. However, if we go to the class has a 010. So that means that because it has a 1 in the middle, that is a higher specificity than the HTML elements. So this could be 001. This would be 010. So this is always going to be applied above this. So whatever has this class is going to have this styling instead of this one. And then we have the ID. The ID specificity is 100. So the 1 in here that is at the beginning makes this have a higher specificity than if we, for example, had the section here, the class section, which is 010, and the element, which is 001. So the ID is going to override the class and the is going to override the class and is going to override the element selectors. So this is important because it can actually affect how we write our CSS. Yes, Bora?
But only by the stylings that are written in it, right?
Yes, exactly. So imagine that, for example, I established that I want the sections to have a background color here. So the background color is going to be maybe beige. So now we can see that all the colors are beige, and because I don't have in the section or in the in the section in the table, I don't have any background color, is going to just inherit the background color of the section, and it's only going to override the properties that I have written inside the rule set. So that is a very good question, actually. So that is the difference between a universal selector, a class, universal element, class, and ID selectors. They are all considered to be simple selectors. Then we also have some combined type selectors. And the combined type is when you use, for example, several selectors in the same place. So for example, if I want to target, yes, Michaela?
Yes, I wanted to ask before you go on, is there the possibility that when we toggle on a selector to see, for instance, 110 or 101?
I was about to get there. That happens when we have combined selectors. So the combined selectors means that we can combine an element selector with a class and an ID selector. And the more selectors that we use in a combined way, the higher the specificity the selector is going to have. So for example, let's say that I want to write here. Let's say that I want to have the section. Okay, and right after the section, I can write the class section. And and then no, I don't have a subsection would be, for example, let's write the class subsection. And okay, so for the time being, I'm gonna be using these two. Okay, so for example, let's say, so now we have the class subsection. So if we toggle over here, we see that we have a 0, 1, 1, right? So this is a combined selector that is specifying which subsections I am actually styling. Oh, Jesus, it's the break. I have just realized. So let's do something. Let's do the break now. We have an hour of lunch break. Enjoy your lunch. We're going to be meeting again at 1 p.m. Like, it's 12:04 actually. So let's meet at 1:05. Okay? Because I don't want to take away from your lunch. So see you guys in a little bit. Have a nice lunch. I'm going to stop the
See you.
recording.